All right. Hello, everyone. This is Keith DeStone, your host for the Cosmos Society Online Open House Series. We're here today with Dr. Eunice Kim, Assistant Professor of Classics at Furman University. I'll just give a brief intro to you, Eunice. You earned your degrees from Brown and the University of Washington, the one that's in Washington. And your interests generally include myth, Indo-European poetics, comparative and historical linguistics. And under that heading, you've contributed some etymological work to the Center's concise inventory of Greek etymology. And that's how I know you. And let's see, your current project is a study of murder and exile in early Greek myth. And so that's related to today's topic, which is confessions of murder in the Odyssey. So before I let you begin, you've told me that you're a regular watcher of these open houses, so it's a special honor and pleasure to have you here. And therefore, you know what's coming next, which is, would you mind sharing with us something about the beginnings of your interest in the classical world, or perhaps even the topic of murder?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I wasn't surprised by this question, and I'm pleased to, share my thoughts on that. I have to admit, I didn't get into classics necessarily for good reasons. Back in high school, I had to take a language, and ultimately I chose Latin so I could avoid speaking in class. But by taking that class, I mean, I really fell in love with the language and the literature, and just really the very ordered, almost mathematical like system by which I was taught the language. And so I pursued that in college and became more involved in the study of the language. So that's how it just sucked me in. So yeah. But my interest in murder is, I don't want this to be cause for alarm, but I've always had like many years of watching Law and Order and The Fugitive, right? And just always fascinated with how murder, I think, vocalizes a lot of larger cultural concerns. And I think the same is true of murder that we see pop up in the Homeric poems. And when I talk about murder, it's not separate from that is the deaths that arise during in a martial context, right? When I'm speaking about murder, it's specifically in a domestic context, and there are very specific consequences to that, normally exile. So that's what I ended up pursuing as my dissertation topic, and I'm still continuing to refine that project right now. And for today's talk, of course, murder and the potential consequences of that is essential to the ending of the Odyssey, right? Where question is, what will happen to Odysseus after killing an entire generation of elite Ithacan young men? And so I'm excited to share that with you guys. So I think we can. I have a couple of focus passages I can walk you all through, and I think it might be more interesting to be conversational about it, where I'll give my own readings and anyone can jump in with questions or their own readings or their own comments, or if people prefer to hear me talk, I can always keep talking. So just let me know.
And if anyone, I just want to say, if anyone does have a question, you might just try unmuting yourself and beginning to speak, because I can't see all of you in this particular view. So I think just feel free to do that, everyone.
Great.
But, all right, please, it's all yours.
So I think I have a PowerPoint set up so that we can project the readings and everyone can follow along. And I only put up the translations just to make it a bit more accessible. So we'll start from there, I think. Great. Yeah. So even though my focus today is going to be on the Odyssey, I do want to start with a passage in the Iliad, which is scroll 24, lines 480 through 484. And I'll just wait to see if the PowerPoint follows along with us. Is it a...
So that's the next slide, I think.
Yes, yeah.
After the intro slide.
There seems to be some delay because I look as it, I got that one actually up. I'll try going to the next one and see if that works.
Yeah.
What are you seeing?
I'm still seeing the title page of the PowerPoint.
Oh, okay, let me come out and try again.
Yeah. But in the meantime, I can mention what that passage is about. It's actually the passage that, the slides are starting to show. It looks like it's on slide 5. So we can jump back to slide 2. Great. Yeah. Does everyone see the relevant passage? Perfect.
I see it, yeah.
So this was the passage that really got me interested in figures who, in fugitive figures who have committed murder previously. And this is perhaps the most famous instance of a fugitive murder. This figure emerges in a simile comparing or describing the entrance of Priam in Achilles' tent. And it says, as when some cruel derangement has befallen a man that he should have killed someone. In Greek, the relevant phrase is photokataktinas, that he should have killed someone in his own country and must flee to a great man's protection in a land of strangers, and all marvel who see him. Even so did Achilles marvel as he beheld godlike Priam. Okay, so this is the final example of 7 fugitive murders that appear in the Iliad. And I was always struck how a figure generally emblematic of exile and displacement is used here to help introduce an important scene of reconciliation. So there's some kind of social bonding aspect to the fugitive, or specifically a murder that I was interested in. And all other examples of famous murders in the Iliad include Patroclus and kind of Phoenix. And interestingly enough, they're all mentioned, their murderous status is always mentioned in the context of explaining where they've eventually successfully resettled. So these murders are always able to find a new successful life outside of their original community, generally having been taken in by a powerful, rich host. And in the Iliad, the iconic host is Achilles' father, Peleus. So that's the general pattern that we see with fugitive murders in the Iliad. And there are 4 more in the Odyssey. And the narratives kind of focus on something else altogether. In every instance in which a fugitive murder is mentioned in the Odyssey, their process of exile is still very much ongoing. They're seeking a permanent place of resettlement, but have yet to achieve it. And this strikes me as remarkably relevant to Achilles' own situation as he seeks to reintegrate himself into his original home community of Ithaca. And so what I have found generally with those Odyssean fugitive murders is that they are encouraging us to view Odysseus's homecoming through the prism of this pattern of murder and exile. So what I think I'll do is just walk through each of the 4 cases specifically and discuss how they relate to the situation of Odysseus. But at this point, are there any questions or concerns, or shall we wait? Okay, great. Then I think we can turn to the next slide, which is really the final example that we see of a fugitive murder in the Odyssey. But I've chosen to focus on this one first because it is directly relating this difficult situation to that which Odysseus is facing himself right now. So at this point, Odysseus and his accomplices have successfully slaughtered all of the suitors. And in the wake of that slaughter, Odysseus says, "Let us, however, consider what we had better do next. When one man has killed another man in a district," and notice it's that same killing formula, photokataktinos. So when such a man has killed another man in a district, even though he was not one who would leave many friends to take up his quarrel, the man who has killed him must still say goodbye to his friends and flee his country. Whereas we had been killing the stay of a whole city and all the picked youth of Ithaca. So he's making a comparison in scale of the murder of one to what he has done, the murder of an entire generation of men. And so if exile is the natural consequence of a single individual, presumably he'll have to suffer exile or a worse fate. And so as we know, I think most of us, Odysseus will get to stay home. And so how does he actually achieve that? I think the cast of fugitive murders that we observe, and they all appear in the second half of the Odyssey, the moment when Odysseus comes home, I think all of those murders help to conceptualize this process of reintegration for Odysseus. I'll return to this particular passage after I go through the earlier examples, and we'll see that there's actually interesting variation on the signature verb of killing here. Notice that Odysseus says of the person who has to go into exile, that person has committed murder using the verb kataktenos. But he varies that verb in reference to what he has achieved by murdering the suitors. He has killed them with the verb apektamen, so from apoktenein, which I think is that lexical substitution is saying something distinctly that about Odysseus's kind of slaughter, which is separate from the kind of murderous violence that generally results in exile. But yes, so that's the final passage. We'll return to that. The very first instance of the fugitive murder, if we turn to the next slide, is in scroll 13, lines 256 through 86. So to give context to this passage, Odysseus has just landed back in Ithaca. He's finally home. And one of the first folks he encounters is the goddess Athena in disguise as an armed shepherd, a young man. And so in his interaction with her, he introduces himself with the first lion tale of Crete. He takes on this Cretan persona and says, "I heard of Ithaca when I was in Crete beyond the seas, and now it seems I have reached it with all these treasures." Sorry, just my screen is moving things around. "I have left as much more behind me for my children, but I'm fleeing because I killed Orsilochus, a man of swift feet and son of Idomeneus, the fleetest runner in Crete. I killed him because he wanted to rob me of the spoils I had got from Troy with so much trouble and danger, both on the field of battle and by the waves of the weary sea. He said I had not served his father loyally in the Trojan district as vassal, but had set myself up as an independent ruler. So I lay in wait for him, and with one of my followers by the roadside, and speared him as he was coming into town from the country. It was a very dark night, and nobody saw us. It was not known there that I had killed him, but as soon as I had done so, I went to a ship and besought the owners, who were Phoenicians, to take me on board and set me in Pylos or in shining Elis, where the Epeans rule, giving them as much spoil as satisfied them." So this is the very first identity that Odysseus adopts upon returning home. And what's remarkable to me is how open he is about confessing to the act of murder to the first person he encounters. Normally, I think you can imagine most folks would try to conceal that fact. It's a very frightening factor. And in fact, some people argue the reason why he highlights his status as a murderer is to be intimidating to the young armed shepherd. But I think here, the details here, there are striking details that anticipate his slaughter of the suitors. Note that he says, it mentions that he accomplishes the murder with an accomplice. And similarly, Odysseus will have many friends helping to slaughter the suitors in the end, foremost Telemachus. And what's interesting here is we have a very deliberate instance of murder. It was premeditated, and there he provides justifications for killing Orsilochus, who seems to be from a rival family of Crete. So there are political tensions here, and there's also a question about the division of spoils from the Trojan War. So summarized in another way, it's a fight about wealth and power, each of which I think are factors in Odysseus's own conflict with the suitors courting Penelope. And so what I have found in reading this passage is, I think, interestingly, Odysseus is kind of rehearsing the actual murder he will commit, and ultimately in scroll 22. And so it's interesting that in the very moment in which he returns home and we are made to wonder what will happen when he achieves this act, he has already cast himself in the role of a murderer already in exile. So in that sequence of the pattern, he's situating himself in a sequence where he can successfully reestablish himself somewhere new. And in this case, it happens to be his original home of Ithaca. So that's what I found very striking about this passage so far. And a couple of more interesting details is that he's pretty explicit in the fact that no one witnessed this crime, right? It was dark, nobody saw us, and he could have gotten away with it. And traditionally, people think that murderers go into exile to avoid the vengeance of the relatives of the poor victim. And this is certainly the case, an example in Iliad 2, where we hear of Tlepolemus, a son of Heracles, who we are told explicitly that he is on the run, avoiding the other Heraclids who want to punish him for committing murder. But here, that doesn't seem to be the case, and perhaps there's an underlying question about pollution that you incur when you kill another individual. But Homer, or the Homeric poems, are generally silent about that concern. Miasma is never mentioned in connection with these murders, although we can imagine perhaps that they were an underlying factor. So the very first fugitive murder we see is encouraging us, I think, to see Odysseus through the prism of the fugitive murderer. And the next three examples will do much the same. So if you turn to the next slide, the second case appears in scroll 14, and the new murderer is not Odysseus himself, but details of his story, I think, encourage us to view them in similar ways. So here, Odysseus is talking to the shepherd Eumaeus, and of course he hasn't revealed himself as Odysseus quite yet. And Eumaeus tells Odysseus, for my own part, I have never cared about asking anyone else since the time when I was taken in by an Aetolian who had killed a man. Here, typically the verb of killing in the context of murder in exile is kataktenos, but it's just the uncompounded form katenos. But anyways, when he has killed a man, this Aetolian came a long way till at last he reached my station, and I was very kind to him. He said he had seen Odysseus with Idomeneus among the Cretans, refitting his ships which had been damaged in a gale. He said Odysseus would return in the following summer or autumn with his men, and that he would bring back much wealth. And now you unfortunate old man, since a superhuman force has brought you to my door, do not try to flatter me in this way with vain hopes. It is not for any such reason that I shall treat you kindly, but only out of respect for Zeus, the god of hospitality, as fearing him and pitying you. So this unnamed Aetolian has an Odysseus connection because he has actually encountered him before, and he is predicting the imminent successful return of Odysseus. And other figures who tend to do that, who also proclaim that Odysseus will return, include Odysseus himself and at least one other fugitive murderer we'll see in the next slide in moments. But I think, again, there's a concerted effort to relate these murderers who openly confess to their crimes to Odysseus to anticipate that climactic violent encounter. So this is definitely the shortest reference to the murder, but in the next slide, we'll see a very remarkable example that other scholars had discussed before. And his passage is so long, so I cut it to the relevant parts. But the third fugitive murder we encounter is this man, a seer named Theoclymenus, who is taken in by Odysseus' son Telemachus. So he is described here as coming to Telemachus, a man from a distant locale, a seer who was fleeing from Argos because he had killed a man. And so this is the singer narrating the situation in which Theoclymenus encounters Telemachus. But in the jump to line 272, Theoclymenus will relate and confess to his own situation. And he says, I too am in exile, for I have killed a man of my own lineage. He has many brothers and kinsmen in horse pasturing Argos, and they have great power among the Argives. I am fleeing to escape death at their hands, and am thus doomed to be a wanderer on the face of the earth. I am your suppliant. Take me, therefore, on board your ship, that they may not kill me, for I know they are in pursuit. So this figure will be taken in by Telemachus and brought to Ithaca, and will have various interactions, but ultimately disappears in scroll 17. And so many scholars have found this figure kind of suspicious, an interpolation in the Homeric poems. But one very intriguing reading I found comes from Steve Reese, who has noticed many parallels between the situation of Theoclymenus and, of course, Odysseus himself. And he argues that the seer is essentially a vestige of another homecoming narrative, another Odyssean tradition in which Telemachus encountered his father Odysseus on the island of Crete, and there brought his father back home, and his father would have taken on this persona of a seer named Theoclymenus. And there are good reasons to see Theoclymenus as a virtual doublet, at the very least, of Odysseus. First and foremost, when Theoclymenus arrives on Ithaca, he is shunted from one home to the other, so frequently displaced from the protection of Telemachus and to the suitors, and ultimately to Penelope in some way. Similarly, Odysseus, when he's home, he's constantly changing locations and interacting with new characters. But I think a very striking parallel here is the way in which Theoclymenus is introduced. His first introduction here is obliquely as a man from a distant locale, and it takes about another 30 lines before we are told of the true identity of this figure, Theoclymenus, or at the very least his name. And there's famously only one other figure who was first introduced obliquely as a man in the very opening of the Odyssey, and it takes about another 20 lines before his full name, Odysseus, is revealed. And so these are figures whose identities are consistently concealed or otherwise repressed, and I think help to encourage us to view the two, or to view these fugitive murderers as virtual doublets for Odysseus. But another striking aspect I want to emphasize about Reese's argument here is that perhaps these murderers I've been talking about actually allude to alternative epic performances or alternative traditions that capitalized on Odysseus suffering the consequences of the murder or the slaughter of the suitors. So here, Reese argues that this is just a vestige of another homecoming narrative, but perhaps it could be a vestige, it could be alluding to the very many traditions in which Odysseus did in fact had to leave Ithaca again. And I'll return to this point again a couple slides down, but my point here is that I think any mention of murder in exile in connection with Odysseus, I think, is trying to point out that the vast majority of surviving references to the fate of Odysseus place him outside of Ithaca as well. So I kind of view these as almost like Easter eggs to other traditions that would have been performed. At this point, I've been talking a lot here, and I can pause for a second. But are there any questions at this point, or concerns, disagreements? I'm open to those as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was wondering what you make of the fact that I think Eumaeus's story about the Aetolian kind of matches the lie of Odysseus that he had told to Athena about being in Crete with Idomeneus. Why is this a kind of echo? Is there some purpose you see in that?
Yeah. I think the way I've approached the lying aspect of this, it's another striking parallel between Odysseus and the Aetolian in particular. But in the case of the Aetolian, there's a negative judgment value there to some extent, where Eumaeus says, as a result, I don't believe in these stories of Odysseus coming home. And so a couple of scholars have viewed that as a negative judgment about other epic traditions that had Odysseus leaving. So it's a kind of meta-poetic comment about the relationship of the Odyssey, a pan-Hellenic poem, to other local traditions. Typically, I think the general, I don't want to generalize actually, but many folks that I've talked to tend to view the Odyssey's relationship with these local traditions as somehow deauthorizing them, devaluing them, or preempting them. Mm-hmm. And that's following in the tradition of a really great argument by Richard Martin that the Odyssey, or really Homeric poetry, is one gigantic speech act, a mythos that undermines and overpowers other local traditions. And so this antagonistic model or relationship, I think, is very important and definitely active. But it's not necessarily the only way to view the Odyssey's relationship with these local traditions. The fact of the matter is that the Odyssey is constantly referencing other local variants, and thereby giving renewed poetic life to local themes. And so I think it's very, very much possible that the Odyssey could be paying homage to these other traditions, and it's not so much severing ties with them and cutting off any sort of relationship with them. The Odyssey is actually incorporating them into its very narrative fabric, and I think that's very much a very positive reconciliatory aspect. Consistent too with my argument about fugitive murderers, who are murderous figures being emblematic typically of displacement and separation, and yet still ironically representative of Odysseus's return home. And so I think that can work on a second order too, where the Odyssey incorporates all these alternative traditions that view Odysseus specifically as a fugitive murderer type.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I had a question. Sorry. Jackie, I had a question on the two verbs for murder, katas. In the later examples that you have, is the word for murder that Odysseus specifically used when he murders the suitors, is that verb, or is it the other verb?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Because one seems to be more purification, because there is the smell of sulfur when he murders all those suitors. Okay, yeah.
So interestingly enough, the verb kataktenein is never used of Odysseus to slaughter the suitors, except when when he first shoots down Antinous, and perhaps it might be useful to turn to that slide in the PowerPoint, and I can discuss the interesting details of the verb there. But he shoots down Antinous, and the suitors, in reference to that one action, use the phrase andra kataktas, so that typical killing verb that results in exile. And they wonder whether or not it was intentional, which is also interesting. Yes, so if we turn to, perhaps it's slide 8 or, oh no, actually this is it, slide 7.
Yeah, I had another question which fits in with this one too, in that is the verb that's used for exile, is that not the agent of change for even the narrative, to pull the narrative along, rather than, if it's purification, it almost implies a stasis.
Could you repeat that question one more time?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I said it very well. I was wondering if the verb, the one that results in exile, is really the important verb here in these Homeric poetry, because it's almost like an agent of change. Okay. You can't, it pulls the narrative along, because you need to have change in order to grow, to progress.
So yeah, in answer to your question, so interestingly, the act of killing is typically subordinated as typically in a participial construction or another kind of subordinate clause. And then the verb of flight, which is always fugain, or some other verb of resettlement, is the primary verb. And so based off those discourse factors, it seems that murder, as it's presented in these formulas, is typically expressed to help explain the immigrant or the fugitive status of these murderers. Yeah, so in the Iliad, all of these cases are explicit about explaining the immigrant status. And then in the Odyssey, all cases of murder, of the act of murder, relate to why the murderer is still in the process of exile and flight. Does that answer your question?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, great. But to your original question here, this is the only case where Odysseus' action is implicated with katakteinein. So when he first shoots down Antinous, the suitors say, "Stranger, you shall pay for shooting people in this way. You shall see no other contest. You are doomed, man. He whom you have slain was the foremost young in Ithaca, and the vultures shall devour you for having killed him." So here, it's the typical verb phota katektones, and note that the direct object of the murder is the word phota, as we've seen before. And it's interesting that all these formulas always place the victim in the accusative case directly before the verb of killing. So I've argued that this is an explicit formula in all of its variants for the situation of murder and exile in Homeric poetry. And the passage continues. Again, this is only the second instance that the suitor spoke, and they thought he had killed Antinous. And so another variant of the formula for killing andra kataktenai. So typically the victim might be mentioned as phota or as andra, both meaning man. But otherwise, during the actual scene of the slaughter of the suitors, kataktenein is nowhere used. It's any other of the tens of thousands of killing verbs that you can have in Greek. There are so many. Actually, if we turn to the next slide, I think this is actually a perfect segue to a point I made earlier. I think it's significant that Odysseus changes the verb of killing in reference to what he has achieved here, right? He says, phota kataktenas, of the typical fugitive murderer, but in his own case, he refers to his killing actions with the verb apoktenein, and that's never used of the murder in flight. And in later In later Greek, apoptenein is a very particular kind of killing for execution. So I think that's an explicit statement about why Odysseus will get to stay in the end. He has not committed a murder that requires his expulsion. He's committed a kind of murder, a violence that is actually reconstitutive to the state of Ithaca, right? He can help restore it, and that requires him to do away with the horrible generation that's been laying waste to his house during his absence. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
After the murder, the exile, is it a punishment given by the demos? It's a collective decision, or the person is fleeing?
Yeah.
Not to escape the punishment.
Yeah. So in all Homeric instances of this pattern, it seems like it's always the murderer fleeing of his own accord for various reasons. We're never told of an explicit sentence given by the deme. So they're only in Odysseus's first lying tale, right? We're told that he fled of his own accord, even though no one witnessed the crime. So we're not quite sure why he's fleeing there, but it's important that he himself decides to do so. And in the Iliad, there's an example I mentioned earlier of a hero named Tlepolemus. There we are told why he's fleeing. He's fleeing in order to avoid punishment, or so that he won't be killed by the victims, by his victims' relatives, essentially. So it's difficult to correlate this with actual legal practice in terms of sentencing, although later Greek homicide law will make that more explicit. Yeah.
So there's an open vendetta going on for the person. If he goes back, he will be killed.
Yes, it seems like that. And that seems to be the case with Theoclymenus as well. This is why he approaches Telemachus. He wants to be taken in so he can be perhaps protected from any further vengeance. Yeah.
I have one more question and
Yeah.
then I'll stop. So rich man takes the person in. What kind of status this person, the fugitive, has in the new community?
Yeah, so the Iliad provides more examples about their eventual status, but many of them get to have quite good lives. They seem subordinate to whatever host took them in. So murderers in the Iliad include Patroclus and kind of Phoenix and Apagius, and they're each taken in by Achilles' father Peleus. In each of those cases, it is clear that while they are esteemed and honored in their new community, they're definitely subordinate to the hosts that took them in. And Phoenix's case is really interesting because once he's received by Peleus, he is gifted essentially a new king. He gets to rule over the Dolopians. These are gifted to him, and yet he is in the war. He's supposed to serve Achilles as well. So there is a dependent status, I think, to many of these fugitives. And that's true of the Iliad. The alternative, again, Tlepolemus is a really interesting case that highlights another pattern we see with these fugitives, that many murderers flee and become colonial founders. They will found their own city. So Tlepolemus, after he kills, he becomes the founder of Rhodes, or one of them. And so he is a city founder, colonial founder, essentially. And this pattern you see all over the place in Greek myth. And even Orestes, after he kills Aegisthus and his mother Clytemnestra, is said to have fled and founded a new city called Argos Oresticum. So it's interesting that these murderous figures are able to reestablish themselves, not just by becoming dependents, but independent leaders in their own right. And this kind of relates to, Keith and I were having a conversation earlier before the live feed, but this strikes me as quite parallel to the situation of Cain and Abel. So when Cain kills his brother, he will go into exile, but also kind of starts building cities and founding a civilization. So it's interesting that these murderers get to be held in esteem, great honor eventually as colonial founders. Yeah, and to relate it to the Odyssey, I think that's what these murders, these cast of murders we encounter are kind of trying to do. They're trying to cast Odysseus not as someone on the verge of exile, but as a fugitive who will get to reestablish himself in Ithaca as a kind of founder figure. So I think there's a colonial framework in which we can see, observe the conclusion to the Odyssey as we have it. Yeah. Any more questions so far? Then
I guess I have a related question.
Yeah.
So this idea of people fleeing after committing a murder makes a lot of sense. What's the motivations of the people acting as hosts? Because it seems like they're not necessarily viewing these murderers in a very negative sense when they show up.
Yeah.
And what would be the motivations, not necessarily within the context of the poetry, but just the broader societal situation where you have these exiles showing up? Why would you take them in? Why would you treat them well?
So I think perhaps it has, right, so outside the Homeric context, I imagine a lot of these figures tend to, all these murders we've seen so far, they tend to be elite figures, right? And so I think there is some political interest in hosts accepting them into their own household, and it perhaps augments their own prestige by being able to take in this kind of fugitive who will in turn be able to serve their household, and we see that in the case of Phoenix and Patroclus and all of the dependents of Peleus, where in return they will continue to serve the family line of Achilles, essentially. So I think it works as a two-way street for sure. Yeah, great.
I'm sorry, I have a follow-up question to that. Is there any distinction in terms of the murderers and the justification for their act in terms of what we, in a more modern context, might consider the justice of their act? Mm-hmm. For example, the one of the stories, the fellow said, so-and-so was planning to take all my property, and so on. Or is there no distinction between, what we would consider right and wrong? They're all the murderers are taken in regardless of the type of or reason for their crime.
Yeah, so in the Homeric poems, there seems to be a distinction made between voluntary and involuntary homicide, and we saw an example of that when Odysseus first shot down Antinous, and the suitor's first question is, "Oh, he's killed Antinous, but perhaps it was unintentional." And in that case, it doesn't seem to have affected the way they're going to respond to the crime. So what I think that's doing is it's clear that they recognize these categories between intentional and unintentional homicide, but at that point, there wasn't necessarily a differentiation in the punishment or in the eventual fate of the murderer. So in the case of the first lying tale of Odysseus, it is clear that is deliberate, that is premeditated. In the Iliad, we have the example of Patroclus, who killed another boy over a game of dice. And there is another explicit reference to it being involuntary homicide. So he did it by accident, so to speak. And since he's so young, his father needs to takes him away, and they ultimately arrive at the household of Peleus. But again, it seems that it doesn't matter. There are no mitigating factors to your age or to the intent in terms of the result of murder. Yeah, that'll be true later on, ultimately. But generally speaking, I think a consistent factor with why murder happens is I think it tends to happen in the context of elite competition, or there seems to be evidence for some kind of internal strife, whether within a given family. A lot of these examples tend to be kin murders of a kind, or within a given deme. And in those cases, I think it is prudent for the murderer to flee for that original community to cohere once again, if that makes sense. Yeah. And so that's certainly the case in the Odyssey, where that competition between Odysseus and the suitors is essentially one of power and prestige and wealth, and also the fate of Ithaca as well. So, yeah. Later Athenian homicide will make distinctions about intentional as opposed to unintentional homicide. But in the Iliad and Odyssey, I don't think we see explicit differentiations like that. Yeah. Sorry, I think. The other way the murders can be viewed, though, is it's a convenient way to explain why these heroes operate in a particular region of the world. So another way that it's not necessarily about the social political factors in the act of murder. What's at stake is kind of mythology and poetic competitions, where it's convenient to explain the movement or the activity of a hero in one region of Greece as opposed to another through this convenient mechanism of murder, because most exile seems to be as a result of murder. And so whenever I see examples in Homeric poetry of these fugitive murders, I always tend to wonder if these are evidence for fissures in a poetic or mythological tradition. And so that's why I'm interested in the case of Odysseus, where we definitely have evidence for different outcomes to the crime he has committed. And perhaps we can turn back to this slide so I can show a couple of examples of that in the ways in which the Odyssey seems to be aware. So this might be slide 10. In fact, actually, we can skip slide 9 for now. Right. So one of the most interesting surviving summaries of what happens to Odysseus comes from Apollodorus. And he says, there are some who say that Odysseus was accused by the relatives of the slain and took Neoptolemus, king of the islands off Epirus, as judge. This Neoptolemus, thinking to get possession of Cephallenia with Odysseus out of the way, condemned him to exile. Odysseus came to Aetolia to Thoos, son of Andrymon, married the daughter of Thoos, and leaving a son he had by her, Leontophanes, died in old age. So here, Odysseus never returns to Ithaca. And the fact that this excerpt places Odysseus in Aetolia, I think makes me reconsider the Aetolian fugitive we encountered earlier as a reference to Aetolian traditions of Odysseus. But he tends to end up in other places. So in the next slide, we have an excerpt from Plutarch, who explains that after the slaughter of the suitors, the relatives of the dead rose up against Odysseus, but Neoptolemus, having been sent for by both parties to serve as arbitrator, pronounced the judgment that Odysseus should depart and be exiled for homicide from Cephallenia, Zakynthus, and Ithaca, and that the companions and relatives of the suitors should pay compensation to Odysseus each year for the wrongs done to his household. Odysseus accordingly departed to Italy, but he transferred the compensation to his son and ordered the men of Ithaca to pay it to him. So Plutarch gives kind of one of the fullest summaries of Odysseus in Italy, but many other ancient sources place Odysseus there as well. Especially Hellenicus, as one example, says that Odysseus founded Italy with Aeneas, so he travels with the Trojan survivors. But what's striking to me here is the majority of sources force Odysseus to leave again. And we have evidence for that even within the Iliad from Tiresias's prophecy. So in my final slide, I think we'll see an explanation of what will ultimately happen to Odysseus, although it's something we never actually see occur. But Odysseus, the seer Tiresias says, but after you kill the suitors in your own house, killing them either by trickery or openly, by way of sharp bronze, you must go on a journey, then taking with you a well-made oar until you come to a place where men do not know what the sea is and do not even eat any food that is mixed with sea salt, nor do they know anything about ships, which are painted purple on each side, and well-made oars that are like wings for ships. And I will tell you a sign, a very clear one, which will not get lost in your thinking. Whenever someone on the road encounters you and says that it must be a winnowing shovel that you have on your radiant shoulder, at that point, you must stick into the ground the well-made oar and sacrifice beautiful sacrifices to Lord Poseidon, a ram, a bull, and a boar that mounts sows. And so I'll stop there for now. Perhaps you are all familiar with this passage in previous online sessions, but the winnowing shovel, which is really an agricultural tool, looks remarkably similar to an oar. So you see a contrast between a land tool and a tool for seafaring. And the other way in which we see an oar in the Odyssey is to signal the mound, the burial place of a sailor. And so here we have a reference to Odysseus traveling to a place where no one knows anything about the art of the sea. And so there he should establish essentially what seems to be a cult to Poseidon, signaling the end of his seafaring ways, the death of his sailor status maybe. So the Odyssey also, I think this is evidence for, again, traditions of Odysseus leaving Ithaca again. So if people say that the Odyssey is severing ties with other traditions that place him outside, I would say this is clearly a way in which the Odyssey incorporates those traditions. Yeah. Any more questions? Yeah. Kind of returning to an earlier question, I realize the other potential remedy to homicide is compensation. And we kind of saw that in the previous passage. Typically, it seems like it's not taken. And that's why I view homicide as a matter of interpersonal conflict and one of elite competition. It's compensation is not something that victims seem ready to take on. They want to punish the culprit.
I have a small question. What about the murder of the women, of the maids?
Of the maids, yeah. Which is horrific. In that case, it seems that the murder of women is never used as an explanation for why someone has to leave. It always seems to be another man of comparable social status, either within a family or within the city. In the case of the women, I think their hanging is framed explicitly as a form of punishment, and so therefore isn't considered murder in the same way. They're not on the same level as Odysseus, horrific as that is. But in the case of the suitors, these are folks, political insurgents who have a claim or are attempting to make a claim on the throne of Ithaca. So I think that's the key difference there. Yeah. Great. Any more questions?
Yes, you think you can draw a parallel with modern history? I mean, the amount of former presidents going into exile and being sheltered by a friendly government? Would you think it's based on the Odysseus model? Yeah,
I do think of these murders as kind of early forms, prototypical political exiles, actually. And so it's striking how remarkably similar, how little things have changed, actually. Yeah, absolutely.
And the universality of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which is still valid in modern times, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should mention, this pattern is clearly, it's not unique to just Greece, although it tends to center in Greece. If anyone knows more mythical examples of fugitive murders, please tell me. I'm trying to collect them. But King Evander, who you might know from the Aeneid, he is said to have fled to Italy because he committed murder in his original home of Arcadia. And someone shared with me an example from a pseudo-mythological history of Ireland. One of the earliest founders of Italy was a Greek parricide, and having killed his father, fled to Italy, introduced the art of agriculture there, and was a pretty well-honored founder figure. But ultimately, he and his family will be destroyed by the gods for that initial crime of killing a parent. And that we don't see. We don't necessarily see retributive violence like that with the murders I've been discussing in the Iliad and Odyssey. Yeah. Great. Well, I just want to say, I really appreciate all of you listening to my thoughts about this topic, and I'm continuing to develop it. And murder is just such it's a topic that I think will never go away, right? It's one that's universal. Yeah.
Hi, Eunice. Beautiful presentation. I was, when you're talking about other examples, I was thinking about the legend of Brutus. According to the Gawain and the Green Knight, founding civilization on the British Isles. So the Iliad simile reminds us that these roles can be reversed, and so there are a lot of losers who escape, just because their city is destroyed, or there's some reason why life is unsupportable where they were originally, that go on to be founders of new cities and colonies in ancient literature.
Yeah, I'm actually not familiar with the Gawain reference necessarily. From King Arthur, presumably, or.
Well, that's the Pearl poet. It's medieval, but how far does it go back?
Oh, sorry. Could you repeat that?
I say Gawain and the Green Knight is an anonymous poet that's called, written by an anonymous poet, medieval English poet, that we call the Pearl poet because the manuscript includes Gawain and the Green Knight and Pearl, and I think one or two other poems.
Oh, okay.
And it, who knows how far back that tradition goes? It's the earliest I know of. Brutus so they have these medieval English poets have a legend of the Trojan War and the escape of a hero named Brutus, which of course is an italic name, showing up and founding civilization on the British Isles.
Oh, okay, great. I wasn't actually familiar with that example personally, so I will look into that. Yeah. Okay. Oh, perfect. Great. So I think I'm waiting to hear back from a colleague, but he has a friend who is researching similarly fugitive murders in medieval literature, actually, and so it seems like there are quite a few examples in that tradition as well. And again, speaking to how long and widespread this mythology, this type is actually in a lot of different cultures. Yeah. I don't know. I'd be interested to see if there's a way to trace kind of an origin point to all of them, or is it just the fact that these are universal situations that everyone wants to talk about? I'm not sure. Great.
Well, I think it's about time to thank you for your wonderful presentation and the conversation you've had with us. Eunice, thank you so much. This is really great.
Thanks so much for having me. This has been such a pleasure. Yeah, great.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. Until next time.
All right. Bye. Take care.